Hey guys, Jeremy here. Welcome to my latest video, and I do want to start by addressing the obvious elephant in the room. And I'm not talking about myself. I am talking about my absence from the 40K scene, especially the media scene, like my video channel. So it's been a while since I posted a video, and as you know by looking just in the library, the last video I posted was kind of my introduction or my start to my Grey Knight season. And I want to start by talking briefly about what's happened and where I'm going forward from here. So I did have some personal issues come up this year that prevented me from pretty much doing anything in my private life that wasn't to do with my personal issue. And so basically meant that I wasn't doing much 40K, I wasn't doing much other forms of gaming, and I wasn't able to really do address any of the project aims and goals that I talked about in my last video. So it meant that I pulled out of a couple of big majors that I was going to take Grey Knights to. And I focused all of the attention, all the time I had to spare was devoted on our Victorian, the Team Victoria for the Australian and Australasian Team Challenge. So it's the ANZ, they call it now, ANZ Team Challenge, where it's all the Australian states plus New Zealand play off in a annual team challenge. And I was the captain of Victoria for that team. And I put all my time into ensuring that we had our best chance as a team, going well in that tournament. And fortunately, we were actually able to take home the win. So I was really proud of that, and paid off. The work we put in as a team certainly paid off. And you can see behind me there, I've got our trophy there from that. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about the team challenge, because I know that the dynamics of a team event are very complex, and maybe that's something I might do a video on in the future, but I don't want to kind of so much go over a review of that event. I'll leave that for a future video. What I do want to talk about is an event I played recently, last weekend it was, called Eastcon 2018. And Eastcon is a Victorian tournament institution. It's been going for a long time. The TO was Matt Morrisoli, and I believe in the end he got 42 players. I think it may have been 41 or 42 players once you include the Gumby. So reasonably sized event, not huge, but also, decent. And I did take Grey Knights to that tournament. I had been kind of wanting to take Grey Knights, so that was what I took. I was a little bit constrained by my model selection because there was a paint score at the event. I wanted to maximize my chance at getting a good paint score, a good overall score. So I took models that were well painted. From a commission army I purchased not long ago from a bloke called Kane Marshall, who's a renowned painter in the Victorian scene. So I took Kane's Grey Knights. I selected from the models he had that I purchased off him. So you'll notice from my list that my list is very different from the list that I kind of hypothesized in my last video that had lots of Strike Marines and things like that. This list has more Terminators. And what I'll do is I'll start by going through the list. But before I do that, I will mention I did go 5 wins out of 5 with this list. So I was able to achieve second overall in both the overall tournament results and also in the ITC placings. So I got myself a pretty handy ITC score from the showing. And obviously to win 5 out of 5 games, the list did perform well. So bear that in mind as you're reading the list, but it certainly doesn't read like what you would expect a tournament kind of ready Grey Knight list to be. So we'll go through from the top. I also want to say this was a 1750 point list, and Matt Morrisoli, the TO, had a special kind of element of the player pack that rewarded people for taking mono faction armies. You gained an extra 2 command points if your army was mono faction or from 1 detachment. So because my army was both of those, I did qualify for the 2 bonus command points, which was a factor as to why I didn't take any allies. Being 1750 kind of I didn't really want to squeeze allies into such a relatively small event, but it was a real bonus that I was able to get those 2 extra command points. So that left me with a total of 10. So the list from the top was my warlord was a regular grandmaster with the Nemesis Demon Hammer, Psy Cannon, and he had the Cuirass of Sacrifice, which is a relic that just gives you 5 up, feel no pain. He was my warlord, and he had Thirst to the Fray as his warlord trait. Then I had a Dread Knight Grandmaster with the Doomfist, Nemesis Greatsword, a heavy Psy Cannon, and Gatling Silencer. I didn't take the jump pack on him because all that lets you do is let you deep strike him. Because I wasn't planning to deep strike him, I wanted to have him on the board for purposes of Heed the Prognosticars primarily. Then I had 3 units of 5 Terminators. Every unit was homogeneous, so we had 4 with Falchions and then the Justicar with the Nemesis Demon Hammer. And that just works out to be a pretty tight unit. Like it's obvious what it's trying to do, but it is quite expensive. Like 228 points just for those 5 Terminators. They were the 3 troops in my battalion. Then I had 2 Razorbacks, each with twin-linked assault cannons, Stormbolter, and Heart Hunter killer missiles. And my last choice was a Storm Raven gunship. And this one had twin assault cannon, twin multi-melter, 2 Storm Strike missiles, and 2 Hurricane bolters. So pretty much almost as kitted out as you can have the Storm Raven. And as you can see there, my total was 1748. So the list, well, as you can see, when I wrote the list, I was trying to work with what I had, but it's not an optimized Grey Knights list. Like, let's be honest here. The Storm Raven, way too expensive. Like, in an optimized setting, you probably wouldn't have those multi-melters on it. You just take the heavy bolters. But I just didn't have them. I was just trying to work with what I had. The Razorbacks as well, I gave them twin-linked assault cannons instead of probably the twin-linked heavy bolters. So I could have shaved points from a few of the fattier units, but there was nothing that was really like that I could punch those points into that I had available. So it kind of was that I wrote the skeleton on my list and then I ended up kind of bolstering and flattening up a couple of the other units to get to my 1750. Having said that, it did give me some relevant firepower in the army. So having the multi-melters, having the twin-linked assault cannons certainly aren't bad things to have. They just aren't necessarily where you would ideally want to spend those points. But I was able to go 5 wins, and I wanted to talk a little bit about how that happened. A lot of people have contacted me since they found out the results. I want to know a little bit about what happened. Are Grey Knights good? Is this some sort of, are we living in an alternate reality? Did I get really lucky? I actually think it's a combination of everything, to be honest. I think I played my games well, but I also got lucky in a lot of situations. I played against some great opponents, but a lot of the lists I played were not considered top of the meta lists. So with no disrespect at all to any of my opponents, my army actually matched up quite well against a lot of them. And I'm sure all of my opponents would agree that when they looked across at my list and they saw the way some of my elements of my army were functioning on the table, they were actually getting, they were getting some questions to have to be answered. So I want to go through a few talking points that you can see at the bottom of the video there that I want to talk about. The first one was the Dread Knight Grandmaster was clearly the MVP in my list. And why was he the MVP? Well, as you remember from my previous list, when I talked about the best units in the Grey Knights Codex and what I thought about Grey Knights, the beauty of the Dread Knight GM is that it's strong over every front, right? He's got decent maneuverability. He's got access, like you can gate him around. He can do that first turn gate and to go for the first turn assault. Both of his guns are pretty good. He's good in combat. And most importantly, once you use Sanctuary on him and you give him Heed the Prognosticars stratagem, he gets a 2-up invulnerable save. Now, it's not a 2-up save as such. It doesn't contradict the Sanctuary FAQ. He only ever has a 3+ invuln. He just gets +1 to his saving rolls. So it becomes effectively a 2+, but it doesn't interact with any of the FAQs in a negative way. So it's a legitimate way to play him, and it certainly makes him scary when you're contending with this model that has a 2-up invuln. So he was the MVP. He was going around. He was taking skulls. He was taking kills. He was offering pressure both with shooting and with combat. And more importantly than those elements, he was very difficult to put down. So my opponents were really struggling to put him down. Probably the biggest threat to him was posed by my opponent, Matt Antonello, who had access to a lot of smites in his army because he was running kind of an Eldar Seer Council style list because he had a lot of mortal wounds he could dish out. I was able to use the stratagem that gives you the 5-up FNP. I think it's called True Silver Armor. Gives you 5-up FNP in a phase against mortal wounds. And that basically, once Matt knew I had that, it reduced Matt's desire to go for those spam, so those fight spams, because I had a few denies available and he knew that I was going to be getting a 5-up. So it was really good to be able to fall back onto that 5-up FNP in the presence of my biggest counter. So it's really nice to be able to know you can have a 2-up invuln with 5-up FNP to smite. So that really strong model. He was definitely the MVP. And I'll talk a little bit about more how that interacts with my future changes to this list in the future down the bottom. The next point was Terminators, right? So you look at those Terminators, went in with these Terminators, and I was kind of laughing about how bad my list was with these Termies, but boy, were they impressive, and boy, were they underestimated by both me and my opponents prior to the way everything panned out. And I think there's a few reasons why Terminators are a lot better than they first seem, and I think it's probably the most intriguing part of my experience at Eastcon. So I will talk about why I think they're so kind of appreciated and underrated, and why it's specific in many ways to ITC. So the first reason is, let's look at the comparison. So who are we dealing with? Like when we take Terminators, the reason why a lot of people won't take Terminators in Grey Knights is because of the presence of Strike Marines and the perception, or the reality, I guess, that Strike Marines are point for point a superior choice. And there's no way that I'm denying that. A Terminator is effectively twice the points of a Strike Marine. And for those extra points, you do get the extra wound, you do get the better save, you do get the extra attack, but the strikes have twice the shooting for those points. Like if you take 2 Strike Marines for every Terminator, then you're going to be shooting 8 shots at short range instead of 4. So even though Terminators have certain elements that they're better than a Strike Marine in, the strikes just have superior volume of fire, which is why a lot of people will err on the side of strikes. Strikes are also cheaper, so it's easier to fill out battalions with Strike Marines. But the Terminators were able to fill a really important role in my list, and they also were, most importantly, once again, as with the Dread Knight, very hard to kill. And that's what I think makes them an intriguing choice in ITC format. And there's a few reasons why. Like the first reason is, as you guys know, in ITC, the primary objective is to kill more points than your opponent, kill more units than your opponent, and control more objectives than your opponent. That's what you're trying to do in ITC every turn. You know, you get a point for killing a unit, a point for killing more, a point for holding an objective, a point for holding more. If your units are really hard to kill, it means your opponents might struggle to even score a single point from killing a unit. They might not even kill any of your units. And that was happening regularly in my games. My opponents were shooting, spreading the fire over a few different units, and actually killing nothing. And then that allowed me in my turn to get a kill and then cap 2 primary points by killing a unit and killing more than my opponent. So Terminators are good at that because they are hearty models. The 2-up save that becomes 1-up in cover is really strong. They also have their invuln, not as relevant when you've got such a good armor save, but the 2 wounds is good. It makes them quite relatively, they become bad targets for small arms fire like bolters and lasguns. It's just not worth shooting at Terminators when not only are you going through 2-up saves, but you've got to do 2 wounds to kill 1. It just doesn't seem worth it. So many opponents don't even bother, which is very different from a Strike Marine. When you've got a Strike Marine that is a power armored troop with that's more expensive than a normal Space Marine, they become a great target for small arms fire like Storm Bolters, bolters, lasguns, etc. So you actually create a polarity shift where you change this philosophy where, I love to shoot my small arms fire Grey Knights troops to, wait, I actually kind of don't want to shoot at that. But what is there to shoot at? Because the whole list has got pretty much 2-up saves. So it really did challenge my opponents and render a lot of their small arms fire quite useless, which did allow me, as I said, to get those primary points and really contribute to getting a head start in games, such that by turn 3 or 4, often in a lot of games, I was so ahead that I could play a more conservative turn 5 and 6 and just guarantee lock in the win. So if you do look at my scores on down under pairings, you'll see that I did a lot of my battle scores weren't huge in a lot of games, but I was able to get the win. And that was primarily through scraping those primary points, but also through denying secondaries. And that's the next thing I want to say, is that this list, it's hard to choose secondaries against because ultimately when you're choosing secondaries, you're prioritizing some sort of unit to kill a lot of the time. So my opponents were sometimes taking Big Game Hunter, but then if they do take Big Game Hunter, they will get like an easy kill against the Storm Raven a lot of the time. But then the Dread Knight is a pain to kill. And if they're shooting Razorbacks, then they're not shooting my damage dealers in the list. So sometimes my opponents would prioritize that Big Game Hunter points, but then as a result of doing that, they let themselves lose too many models because they weren't killing effectual units in my army. Or if they went with something like a frequent choice was Marked for Death, and the Terminator units all qualify as Marked for Death targets. So they were choosing Terminators to mark for death, but then I was deep striking my Terminators a lot of the time, or at least 2 units of them. And then I was able to play really defensively with my Terminators, like deep strike them into cover to get a 1-up armor save that then makes them kind of like almost gives them an improved invulnerable save, because against like a las cannon, they'll have a 4-up instead of a 5-up. So my opponents were choosing Marked for Death. I was playing defensively with my Terminators, deep striking onto objectives, sacrificing their shooting because their shooting wasn't necessarily their strong point. You know, their strong point's more their defensiveness. So I was prioritizing a defensive stat line, going into combat where I could, using First to the Fray where I could, but the Terminators were acting as bulwarks that were basically guaranteeing or solidifying my ability to score the primary while denying the secondary from my opponent. So my opponents were really struggling to score points off me. So that was the Terminators were really helping because of their ability to bait out the Marked for Death. I was actually really happy when my opponent chose Marked for Death on my Terminators, because what it meant was it allowed me to leverage the control that I have over them. And to reiterate or to expand on that, the Terminators don't really deploy on the board, and if they do, they don't deploy out in the open. So I can kind of dictate what in my opponent's army can shoot at the Terminators and when. If I really want, I don't have to deep strike them turn 2. I can wait a whole other turn, deep strike them turn 3 defensively, put them in a position in the board where they're defendable, and just really make my opponent struggle to kill them. Because they're only 5 model units, they aren't very vulnerable. They are not very vulnerable at all to morale, which is another strength they have. Whereas with like a Strike Marine unit, if you have a unit of 10 Strike Marines, suddenly it's vulnerable to morale once you've lost about 7 or 8. So your opponent can pick up 2 easy kills for free, or you end up getting forced to spend command points to auto pass the check. Whereas with Terminators, units of 5, they're still hard to kill. Whereas a unit of 5 Strike Marines, the 5 Strike Marines avert or alleviate the morale issue, but then you just have 5 Strike Marines in a unit, which are really, really easy to kill. So I really liked the kind of sureness I had with units of 5 Terminators. You get some good value out of their falchions, and the Nemesis Demon Hammer on a Justicar actually is a pretty good deal. Like, he's got the 3 attacks. It's fine to spend those points on that model. And I think once you're spending that entry cost of a unit of Terminators, I think it is worth taking a single hammer, just because it gives you that threat to be able to punch through stronger units if you have to. So that was the cornerstone of the success on my list was the power, the raw power of the GM, of the Nemesis Dreadnought GM, and the reliability of my Terminators and the ability that they allowed me to really win primary and secondary. As for some of the other units in my army, I'll touch on the other units because there obviously aren't that many. The normal Grandmaster was a bit underwhelming. Yes, he brought First to the Fray. Yes, he's got a side cannon. Yes, he has the Demon Hammer, but it's just harder to position that model because I have such a small model count in the army. In order for me to protect my Grandmaster, I often wasn't really being that aggressive with him. So even though he's got a good stat line and all that, he wasn't able to bring it to bear that often. So I'm not a fan of him as much as I should be, and I will talk about the changes I'll make to the list about that in a second. The Razorbacks were good, actually. Being able to put them in cover or keep them on objectives backfield gave me that backfield presence that I needed if my Terminators wanted to push forward a little bit into midfield and forward objectives. The assault cannons were as expected. They weren't as impressive as they could be. And to kind of expand on that, I actually would change into heavy bolters because the heavy bolters do give you that extra range. So they would be able to stay back, stay stationary, and contribute at 36 inches rather than at 24. There is merit if you've got the points to even giving them las cannons, but I liked the fact that they weren't a great target to really shoot. So, and that's why I think the heavy bolters are a better choice, because you reduce the cost of the model even further. So what you're effectively doing is saying, I've got this toughness 7, 3-up save, potentially 2-up save model in the backfield. I've got all this other stuff that's coming at you that's more threatening. Why would you shoot my Rhino or my Razorback? You've just got no real incentive. So it's just forcing your opponent into these decisions they don't want to make, but forcing them into decisions that ultimately are solidifying your own win, because my opponents were not shooting my Rhinos or my Razorbacks, but by not shooting them, they weren't picking primary points up. They were shooting at Terminators, and then there'd only be a couple of Terminators left in cover out of line of sight. And my opponents were grappling at ways to try to finish off units, and they were really struggling. So the Razorbacks were good, but they didn't need that extra cost from the assault cannons. The last unit was the Storm Raven. And yes, the Storm Raven does have an impressive kind of array of shooting, but it unfortunately in the metagame at the moment, and the way that Codex releases have occurred, people are used to the -1 to hit that Storm Ravens have. People are like used to dealing with up to -3 or -4 to hit from Eldar. So -1 to hit doesn't seem that good anymore. And it just goes down really quickly. So in pretty much every single game, it went down turn 1 or 2. There's nothing I could do to stop that. It's just, it's always people are always going to draw line of sight to it. Doesn't have an invulnerable save. It just goes down. And it was a liability, actually. It wasn't very good at all. There was some value in my game against Matt Antonello, who had a Seer Council, like the big Warlock Conclave on bikes. I took Astrolabe and cast Astrolabe on my Storm Raven, which let me shoot through a ruin to shoot at that Conclave as an alpha strike. And that was really good. But I could have put that Astrolabe on my Dreadnought and if I wanted to instead. I ended up drawing line of sight with the Dreadnought naturally. So I was able to have my cake and eat it. But as it turns out, I feel like, and this is moving into that next point, that last point, I think that Storm Raven should just be another Dreadnought, which is effectively the same thing, right? Like, I took that Storm Raven because I had the model and because I thought it would act as a deterrent from people shooting my Grandmaster. And the logic is kind of like, well, sure, if you want to shoot the Grandmaster instead, well, then my Storm Raven will just stay alive for longer. And it was good in that it allowed me to deploy a unit of Terminators inside it to reduce a drop. But I do feel like that just wasn't pulling its weight. Like, even if you do cut it back to the heavy bolters instead of the multi-melters, it's still more than it's like a 320-point unit. It's still too much. So how would I change my list? What would I do instead of the Storm Raven and some of the other things? I would put that second GM in, Nemesis Dreadnought Grandmaster. I would be cutting that normal Grandmaster, just upgrading him. Like, if you look at the points difference there, the normal Grandmaster is 193 points and the Nemesis Dreadnought GM is 275. So it's not even that much more to just upgrade into this simply superior chassis. So I personally, that's what I'd be looking at doing. And then dropping the Storm Raven altogether. So I'm gaining quite a lot of points by doing that. And the things I've been investigating doing with those points is basically adding in, if you want to stay mono Grey Knights, then I'd be adding in more things like Razorbacks and solidifying those kind of cheap ways to control the board from the backfield so that the rest of your army can go forward and be aggressive. But I also feel like I was really strongly benefited from those 2 extra command points that I was able to obtain from the unique tournament format. I would probably be going to another battalion. And unfortunately, it's really hard to do that with mono Grey Knights. So if I was to move to, a non-unique tournament format where I had to take that extra battalion, I would be probably taking an Imperial Guard battalion or a Sisters of Battle battalion or a Blood Angels battalion, some way to just get those cheap command points that you need to fuel, primarily Heed the Prognosticars. I was pretty much, the Dreadnought was spending a minimum of 3 CP per turn. 2 for, and sometimes more actually, 2 for Heed the Prognosticars, and then 1 for a command reroll in the shooting phase. Because when you've got a 12 invulnerable, you're going to be wanting to use a command reroll on that. And you probably want to use another command reroll maybe in the assault phase if you get assaulted. and you take another high increment of damage. So I was using 3 or 4 command points per turn just on the Dread Knight. So you want to have more command points to be able to like fuel the Dread Knight for longer. So what would I be doing to change the list? To reiterate, I'd be getting taking a cheap battalion, taking the double Dread Knight GM, then the question then becomes who takes first to the fray, because you don't want to really take it on a GM, because if you take it on a GM, that Warlord's just going to get sniped out. So I think you then do take an Ancient. This list didn't have an Ancient. I would probably, that's something you want to slot in, because you take an Ancient, give it first to the fray. I actually really liked the Cuirass of Sacrifice on my GM. So I would probably take an Ancient with the Cuirass of Sacrifice. I wouldn't worry about the Relic Banner, which is an interesting kind of revelation. And the reason for that is I was not casting Smite as often with some of my supporting casters because I was too busy casting Grey Knight powers. So yes, you can take this Relic Banner and then, then you might have to take a Brother Captain to double its range. You're doing all these things and you're in this loop when you could just be casting the Grey Knight powers that often are better anyway, like Vortex of Doom, for example. So I'd be taking my Paladin Ancient or Terminator Ancient, whatever you want, and then instead of worrying about the Relic Banner, I just give him Cuirass of Sacrifice, and then I would be taking Vortex of Doom on him potentially. As for the other powers, you want at least 2 sources of Sanctuary if you've got the double Dread Knight. So each Dread Knight needs to have Sanctuary, and then you probably want 2 sources of Gate as well. So I'd be taking Gate on 2 units of Terminators so that you've got some redundancy, because you need to be really trying to gate every turn. So you need to make sure that you've got Gate on a couple of sources. So just to go through this list, what I'd be doing is I'd be going Sanctuary on the 2 Dread Knights, then I'd be going Gate, and maybe something like Astral Aim on the 3rd unit of Terminators, or Vortex, or Hammerhand. Hammerhand's a good option as well. So you're basically picking between Astral Aim, Hammerhand on that 3rd unit. And then on my Ancient, I'd be taking Vortex. So that's how I would be calibrating the list. There is some room to move. Like you could go, there's a couple of other things, like the one that you compare leadership. That could be something you consider as well, depending on like what you're versing and how you're wanting to kill things. Guys, that pretty much rounds out the video. So to recap, the list did perform really well. There were some really kind of, fortunate and lucky situations that occurred, but some real little nuggets of like pleasant surprises that happened as well. Like the Terminators, a really pleasant surprise. For all the reasons I iterated so far, they really are pretty good in ITC missions. And I think if they do get another points reduction, they might actually become quite a strong unit. I think they're probably about 4 or 5 points too expensive still. But if they drop to something like 38 or 39 points, rather than like 44 or whatever they are now, I think they would actually go back to being the premier troop unit for Grey Knights. They're not far off. They're closer than we thought, which is interesting. And that's the beauty of playtesting. And it's a shame due to my personal situation that I wasn't able to get these revelations through earlier. Before I leave, though, I will quickly say we have had that big FAQ 2 that has dropped. I don't think there's too many implications of that on this list. I think that the ability to go second and get +1 save makes all of this stuff better. Like it does make Grey Knights a lot better because they're getting, like taking 3-up saves on Razorbacks down to 2-up is really good. Going down to a 1-up save on your GMs is pretty good as well against things like Dark Reapers. But I don't think it's going to change the way we think about this list too much. So obviously it is going to change the rest of the metagame. Smash Captains have gotten a bit worse. Other things that wanted to do those first 10 assaults have gotten a bit worse. But I don't think the meta is going to change too much from this big FAQ. I think it's going to be the chapter approved that will shake the meta up with the points changes. Anyway, guys, see you for my next video. I do have a couple of events coming up that I will be taking Grey Knights to, so you'll be getting some more updates soon. If you've got any questions, leave them in the videos, send me a PM, however you want to do it. I'd love to chat more about Grey Knights. Catch you soon.